Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning to our friends in Gallup as well this morning. It was May 13th, 2001. It was Mother's Day, and our middle son, Joel, decided that 3 weeks early was going to be better than actual due date. And so he was born on the morning of Mother's Day. I actually got to skip church. One of the few times I got to skip church, right? Within a few hours, Joel was actually on a hospital or in a helicopter on his way from St. Joseph, Missouri, down to Children's Mercy Hospital. They could not keep his oxygen up. Even though he was 9 pounds, 5 ounces, his lungs were underdeveloped. So as a result, he ended up spending the first 3 or 4 weeks of his life in the hospital. So I eventually got down to Kansas City that day. It's about a 50-mile drive from St. Joseph. I got into the NICU and immediately sought out people who knew where Joel was, what was going on, and got to talk to a neonatologist. And he basically told me that somehow, some way, Joel had not just underdeveloped lungs, he had a collapsed lung. So as a result, they put in a chest tube, different things like that. So slept in the waiting room of NICU that night. As soon as they let me in the morning, I was in there to see Joel. Tara was still up in Missouri, up in St. Joseph, Missouri, because she had a C-section and so on like that. That particular morning, a team of doctors came in to examine Joel. It was a teaching hospital. And as they were examining him, the lead doctor said, "Get the surgical suite ready, stat." And so they worked a little bit more and worked a little bit more. You could tell things were very frantic, and they were able to stabilize him. But it was an intense 5 or 10 minutes for me. And as a nurse walked by, I just looked at her, and I said, "Is my son dying?" And she said these words, "Not now, but make the phone calls you got to make." So my next action, there's still a little bit of a bone of contention between my wife and myself because she was up in the hospital C-section, couldn't do anything back where we were. I called my best friend. In Amarillo. He is a pastor there. His name is Mark Zimmerman, and I just wanted him to pray. When I called him, another one of our very good friends, Judd Wilhite, was in the room with him. They prayed with me over the phone, and I just started making phone calls for people to pray. The next day, Tara got to come and be with us in Kansas City. And I will say the next couple of days were very tenuous. Joel had moments where he was critical and moments where he was stable. One afternoon, in fact, I think it was Wednesday afternoon, we had a conference with doctors. By the way, a conference with doctors is never a good thing. But they laid out a plan of action. Basically, Joel was already on a ventilator, but his oxygen kept dipping into the 50s. And they could not, no matter what they were doing, could not keep that oxygen up. So the doctor said, we're going to put him on a ventilator that gives him 600 breaths per minute. It was like being on an air compressor. It was like super wild. But they would also put nitric oxide into his lungs to relax the lungs. And they said, if this doesn't work, we're going to do a procedure called ECMO. And some of you know what that is, but it's a pretty delicate procedure, especially for a baby. But as we got done, we signed the consent forms. We immediately started calling friends and family and anybody that we could possibly contact to say, would you pray for Joel? And there were literally people praying all throughout the world for him. And we just didn't know what else to do. So next morning, we round a corner to head to the elevator, and we see Joel's doctor. And he is shaking his head. And he said sometime within an hour of putting him on this ventilator, his oxygen normalized in a speed that I cannot explain. And so Tara and I said, we would like to. We sent out a call for prayer last night. And we're thoroughly convinced that this is not medical science, but this is God. And he said, well, there's probably no other explanation. So we love stories like this, do we not? Well, we love to hear stories of answered prayer. We love to hear stories where God moves in dramatic ways. And I'm sure you have a story and maybe many stories where you can say God emphatically answered prayer in such a clear and profound way. But we also have other stories. We have other stories where we prayed and we prayed and we prayed, and God said no. And we cling to these stories over here like, hey, these are great, and these are the stories that like they make it into devotional books and different things like that. But at the end of the day, we also have to grapple with sometimes God says no. And so what do we do when God says no in prayer? How are we to respond? Are we able to basically look at that and understand God is still moving and God could still display His power? So what do we do when the healing doesn't come? What do we do when the marriage that we've prayed for so long still doesn't make it? What do we do when there's a temptation or an insecurity that has plagued us and it just doesn't seem to go away? And we've prayed for it to go away, but it just sticks around. You see, today we're going to examine a prayer of the Apostle Paul. In fact, we're in this series called Praying with Paul. We're kind of taking a look at a few of the times that we read about his prayers in the letters that he wrote to various churches. And Paul talks about a time where God says no. In fact, it was a very clear no. It's actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and it's going to be page 844 in the Bibles in the seats in front of you. If you don't have a Bible, you are more than welcome to take one of ours. But before we hop into this passage here this morning, I want to kind of bring you up to speed on what's happening. There are some people that are connected to the church in Corinth that claim to be super apostles, right? And I don't know if they wore capes, but the fact of the matter is they were saying we're better than Paul because of the spiritual experiences that we have had. We've had all these visions and all these revelations. And so Paul, in response to them, tells about his own spiritual experience. And we find that starting with chapter 1 or chapter 12, verse 1. It says, this boasting will do no good, but I must go on. Like Paul's like, listen, I don't want to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about this. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations I had from the Lord. I was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Now, I don't know what the third heaven is. I'll just kind of give you maybe a suggestion of what the third heaven is that, you know, like the sky and the clouds and so on like that might be first heaven, and then the stars and the moon and, you know, kind of like the universe would be second heaven, and third heaven would be like God's place of dwelling even beyond that. So that's probably the best explanation, but we really don't know. But he says this, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in the body or out of my body, I don't know, only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body, but I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. Now, Paul's experience, I'm just going to tell you, Paul's experience of the vision of heaven is radically different than the visions of heaven that people share today. And I don't want to discount those, But when people say, I went to heaven and I saw this and I saw this, so many of those are man-centered experiences, and they want to get into all this incredible detail. Paul's like, I cannot tell you what I saw. What I saw, I just can't go there. And so that's one of the things I think we need to grapple with there. But he said that experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I will boast only about my weaknesses. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God, so as to keep me from becoming proud. I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. So interestingly here, Paul had like this amazing vision, this amazing experience. But here's one of the things I want you to know. This is the only time in all of Paul's letters in the New Testament that we read about this. It's not like he's walking around saying, hey, yo, let me tell you about my experience. Let me tell you about how great I am. Paul is not doing that. But here's one of the things that he did drop into this conversation. He does mention the thorn in his side. He mentions about this messenger of Satan that was sent to torment him. Now, this is kind of a big thing in my mind, but it does kind of reveal something very important for us to wrestle with here today. And it's this, that the most amazing spiritual experience does not exempt me from suffering. I think we've bought into the idea that if we can have the grandeur, if we can have like this out-of-body thing, this miraculous thing that would happen to us, then that's the pinnacle of our spiritual life. But Paul understands that regardless of that, he also had suffering in his life. Regardless of this incredible experience that he had, where he got to go into heaven, he got to experience things that we're going to have to wait till we get to heaven to know what Paul actually experienced. He also understood that suffering is a component of life. And it's kind of like the health nut who gets cancer. Right? We kind of have the idea that if we do everything right, we're never going to have to suffer. It's the guy who runs a marathon that drops dead of a heart attack while he's out on a run. It's the parents who think that they've done everything right with their kids and they still have kids walking in the wilderness. It's the marriage that put up all the guardrails, did all that they could to prepare to go into marriage, but they still hit a speed bump. And so the reality is suffering is going to be part of life. In fact, wise man once said, and I'm going to call that wise man Jim. If you were here last week, right? That suffering is a pathway to God's comfort. And when we suffer, we have the opportunity to comfort others. In other words, God can use the negative things that happen in life. So real quick, though, I do want to ask a question. What was Paul's thorn in his flesh? We really don't know, but it's perplexing to me that if you do a deep dive into this, the number of items that theologians have mentioned as possibilities. Like one possibility is inner psychological struggles. In other words, Paul was like struggling in his mind. Maybe the guilt of the fact before Jesus called him on the road to Damascus that he persecuted Christians. Maybe that's something that he just couldn't get over, wouldn't escape. Maybe it was depression. Maybe it was a feeling of unworthiness because of what he had done. Could be loneliness. Another option that theologians, people a whole lot smarter than me, have suggested that maybe the thorn in his flesh was difficult people. Did we strike a nerve? If you look at Paul, seriously, everywhere he went, people were pushing up against his ministry. So you can do whatever they could to stop him. And listen, one of the things that we have to understand about the gospel is so offensive and counter to the larger culture, it will always try to squelch the gospel. It always will. And people will always be doing that. Some have suggested that it is a physical ailment of some kind. In fact, I'm going to throw out some of the physical ailments that different guys have suggested. Many have suggested that Paul had poor eyesight. Like when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, had that bright light. I mean, you think that he might have just maybe it was cataracts, but he just couldn't see very well. And that's the thorn that was in his flesh. Others have suggested that, in fact, the areas that Paul traveled and the day and time that he traveled in, malaria was very common. And once you recover from malaria, one of the things that lingers is migraine headaches. Some people suggest that it was a speech impediment. If you had to nail me down, if it is like a physical ailment, I'm going to say it's his eyesight. Because I think it comes out in a few of his letters. Others have suggested it was demonic harassment, like the messenger of Satan, that there was a real spiritual battle that was going on, that there was a spiritual attack that was happening in his life that was unrelenting and would not go away. But here's the reality. As I've talked about psychological struggles, many of you get anxiety and you get guilt from past sin and you get depression. And so you're thinking, I get that. Because no matter what, it just won't go away. When you think about difficult people, you're saying, yeah, struggle is real on that. That there are difficult people always, and it just, I cannot escape them. I think about spiritual or illness and physical struggles. Those are real things. And many people deal with chronic, issues constantly of dealing with that. There's also the issue of the spiritual attack, the temptation that might be coming, the unrelenting spiritual warfare that we realize is going on all around us. And so I've mentioned all of those. I'm going to say Satan chooses to use every single one of these to try to draw people away from Jesus. So regardless of what it is, I think maybe it's open-ended for a reason that we don't know what it is. But I want you to see Paul's response to his thorn. Let's read verse 8. 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. Now, I don't really understand what the significance of 3 is here. Maybe it implies the repetition in prayer or the persistence in prayer. Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, he actually prayed 3 times that this be taken away from him. And so maybe it was consistent with that. But here's what I do know. Paul appropriately prays for his thorn to be removed. You see, sometimes, I'm just going to tell you, sometimes there are things that are present in our bodies that we know are not supposed to be there. And when they're there, we want to do what we can to get them away. Like the other day, I was in Walmart. You probably see me there once or twice. I was in Walmart and I was pushing the cart and I was like, what? And I had this huge splinter in my thumb. And it didn't hurt, it was just irritating. And I have a little OCD, so I could not wait until I got home, did the minor surgery. You got the needles out and the pliers out and everything, to get that bad boy out, because I knew it wasn't supposed to be in there. But when we're dealing with stuff that's bigger than splinters, when we're dealing with guilt and we're dealing with depression, we're dealing with regret, we're dealing with sin, we're dealing with temptation or difficult people, physical ailments, whatever it might be. These are big things. And sometimes they're bigger than us. And really, for us to try to do this on our own, it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, right? And so the reality is it's very appropriate to rely on the power, perfection, and provision of God. We should pray. We should pray in these situations for God to move. And so it's perfectly appropriate. But I want you to understand how Jesus responds. Let's look at verse 9. We're going to read just the very first part of it. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So Jesus said, I'm not taking it away. My grace is all you need. My grace is sufficient. I know this is a tough pill to swallow. God does not owe you or me our greatest desires in life. He really does not. In fact, sometimes God chooses to keep things in our life, like Paul said, to keep me from becoming proud, but also to remind us of God's grace. In fact, I look at it, if God gave me everything I wanted, I would not be amazed by his grace. So he says, listen, your greatest need is your sin need. Greatest need is a need that you, and listen, you got to realize, I can't do anything to save myself. I can't do anything to save myself. But God took care of that greatest need through his son, Jesus. So what are we to do? Here's a big question. What are we to do when God continually says no or not yet to our most persistent prayers? Well, really, what are we to do? Brutal honesty here. 2008, my wife got sick. I would love to be able to tell you a story about prayer and God answering that prayer and saying, hey, all is good. It's 2024. I'm still praying for God to heal my wife. God hasn't come to me in bodily form or in a vision or even audibly and said, no, I'm not going to heal her. So until I hear that, I will continue to pray that God will heal her. So what do we do with that? We continue to pray that God will heal. But I do think that maybe we need to change the way that we pray when we're still waiting to hear that affirmative yes from God. I'm going to ask another question, and this question is meant to meddle into your life. What if God's desire is not to take something from you, but to do something in you and through you for his glory? What if the thing that we just wish this would go away, God? What if that's the one thing that God says, no, I'm not going to take it away. I'm going to do something in you and through you, but it will be for my glory. Notice verse 9. Let's read all of this here. It says, each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ will work or can work through me. I love how the English Standard Version kind of translates, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I believe with all of my heart that our weaknesses become God's platform to display his glory. I truly believe that. I truly believe that God can take what our weaknesses are, and he says, that's how I'm going to work through you. That's how I'm going to display my power through you. In fact, I'll even go as far as to say, God's power is best seen when it's not competing with our abilities. Seriously. And I'm going to share a story with you here today. Now, as I share this story, please understand, I'm not trying to draw attention to myself. I just want to let you know how God worked in my life. How God worked in my life through long haul. Like, for example, just to be brutally honest with you, I have social anxiety. I am socially awkward. I really am. I remember, like 4 or 5 years old, hiding behind my parents anytime there were people that I didn't know around me. Scared to death to meet new people. In fact, it's kind of been lifelong. Now, I grew up in a small town, knew everybody and so on like that. After I graduated high school, moved away, actually went to a college group where there was about 100 college students in it. I knew zero there. Guess what they made us do if we were new? Stand up and introduce ourselves. I wanted to die. And I never went back. So I got to college. I was in Bible college, and I hadn't quite yet figured out that God wanted me to be in ministry. But I was there. And there was a day, there was actually a weekend, there's a place called Cookson Hills in a place called Kansas, Oklahoma. It's a children's home. And part of the college and one of the bigger churches in the Dallas area all went together, and we did the thing called Christmas in March, where we went up and did Christmas for the kids at the children's home and so on. And on Sunday, there's a group from the college that led worship, and the president of the college preached. And I've been in Bible college all of like 2 months. And they said, Brandon, we want you to do the communion devotion that morning. So I was like, sure, okay. I don't want to talk in front of people, but if you tell me to do that, I'll go ahead and do that. So I got up and I looked out at this big A-frame kind of sort of church, and I see what seemed like 1 million people. It was probably 200 to 300. I got up, I locked up, and I don't remember much after that. But I do remember what happened after the worship service. I remember the president of the Bible college that I attended walking up to me, and he was kind of a pale guy, but he was red. And he said, "That was horrific. That was terrible. In fact, that was an embarrassment to the college," and walked away. And at that point in time, I said, I will never talk in front of people again. Ever. Fast forward a few months, I was in a church camp in Oklahoma. The name of the town, Honubby, Oklahoma. Anybody know where Honubby is? So Honubby, southeastern Oklahoma. Get there, and there's like 10 area pastors and 6 students for this entire week of church camp. But they had scheduled me, my friend Mark, and myself to do a campfire devotion. Now, I was explicitly told by the president before going out, no public speaking. You're representing the college, you don't do it. But they had me scheduled. So I looked at my friend Mark, and he said, you got to do it. And so I did it. I can't tell you what I talked about. I really can't. But as I talked at campfire, something happened. And I remember Orville Prather was his name. He was about 120. And he had light blue polyester leisure pants, remember those? And a white shirt, Western shirt that snapped. And he came up to me the next morning and said, young man, you need to preach. And I fought against it for a while. Now, I don't tell you that to say, hey, look at me. But I can tell you dozens, if not hundreds, of stories where God takes people's weaknesses and says, hey, by the way, I want to use that. I don't want to use your strengths. I don't want to use your abilities. I want to use your weakness because I want Jesus to get the spotlight. And that's ultimately what happens when God works through our weaknesses. So let me say it like this, and this is our bottom line for this morning. God answering no in prayer is His platform to reveal His power, His glory through your weakness. There might be something in your life right now that you have yet to figure out why it's still there. Why you still struggle with that? Why do you still have this illness? Why do you still have this guilt? Why do you still have this depression? Why do you still have this messenger of Satan that just won't go away? Maybe it's so that God can do something in you and through you to display how great He is, because when they look at you, they say, it can't be you. This has to be God. And so I'm thoroughly convinced that if you've got that thing, that insecurity, that physical, whatever it might be, God can use it. Is it still okay for you to pray? I think so. We'll get to that here in a moment. But as we talk about the head and the heart and the hands here today, I want to share this with you. First of all, be content. Be content. In fact, I want to read verse 10 to you from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and the insults and the hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This word for pleasure literally means I am well content. I am well content in my weaknesses. In fact, it's almost as though Paul is saying, I willingly choose weakness. My preference is not my strength, it's not my intelligence, it's not my power. My preference is my weakness. Because when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when I'm strong, through weakness, it's not my strength at all. And so he says, I was content in weakness. I was content with this messenger of Satan. I was content with this thorn in my flesh because I know that it's better for the kingdom and it's better for God, and God can do something through this, even if it's just me comforting other people who suffer in a similar way. Also, in your heart, pray that God will use His no to display His power. So I mentioned about my wife. Until death do us part, or until God heals her, I will continue to pray. I will continue to pray for her healing. We don't share this story a lot, but I will tell you that when we do, it is amazing to me the number of people that come and say, I got the same thing. How do you deal with this? And we've been able to minister to people through a standpoint of this weakness, this trial, and this suffering, so that God can get the glory. And so, whatever you're walking through, just pray. Pray that God will use it for His purpose, for His glory, for His honor. And then finally this, lean in. Lean in with anticipation that God will display His power through your weakness. So when you suffer, lean in. When there's a health issue or depression or an anxiety or guilt, if there's a physical ailment, or if there are difficult people in your life, lean in. Lean in to say, God, listen, I know I don't want this. I don't like this. I really don't want to be walking through whatever it is that I am walking through right now. But I'm going to lean in because I'm living with anticipation that you're going to take this weakness, this moment, this whatever it is, and you will use it for your glory. And your glory will be displayed not in my ability, not in my strength, not in my intelligence. Your glory will be displayed for all to see through this weakness that I have in life. Will you join me in prayer? Father God in heaven, thank you. Thank you for the suffering that you take us through. Thank you for the parts of our life that we would prefer go away because we don't like to be uncomfortable. Thank you for those. And Father, I pray that you display your amazing glory and splendor, not through the times that we are awesome, but the times that we are weak. Thank you. In Jesus' name.